podcast of the PPO, podcast about everything from the world of public procurement.
Dear listeners, welcome to another episode of Public Procurement Office podcast. Today I will speak with another interesting guest, Mr. Professor Pedro Telles from Portugal.
Thank you.
Good morning. Mr. Professor, could you please introduce yourself and tell me how did you actually get to the public procurement topic?
I think that's a good way to start. I'm Pedro, and I qualified as a lawyer in Portugal, then worked as a lawyer in Spain. Most of my work in Portugal was in procurement law. Then I did my PhD in the UK in public procurement law, stayed in the UK working in academia, and a few years ago, 6 years ago, I moved to Denmark, and I'm working at Copenhagen Business School for the last 6 years. And usually the joke is that people fall into procurement. That's how they end up working in procurement. In my case, it was slightly different because I actually had public procurement as a subject in university.
Voluntarily?
Yes, in my last year in law school in Portugal, and it was the highest grade that I had in the whole degree. So I thought, well, maybe I could do something there. So that's basically what happened there.
So now you are teaching on the university this topic?
I do teach public procurement, but only in a program that runs in the Balkans, in Belgrade, at CBS, at Copenhagen Business School. My teaching takes me to some of my other interests in law that are beyond procurement.
You mentioned business school. That is interesting because usually when I have all these professors here, they strictly teach on the law schools, and then I always ask them, what do you think is public procurement for, if for lawyers or for economical subjects?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think that I'm more suitable or more suited to work with a mixture of law and non-law students because I was a practitioner, but as a lawyer, I did a lot of work that was hands-on beyond just law in public procurement. So I have that connection to practice and to the needs of contracting authorities and also economic operators that sometimes might be lacking in people that just do law as an academic career.
But what do you still think who should be the main subject of the public procurement lawyers, or?
It's not a question of who should be the main subject. For example, there is a course at CBS on public procurement that mixes law and business. So it's a joint course that is taught by my colleagues, some from law, some from business, and that makes perfect sense because it targets a wider surface area of what procurement is and the constraints that procurement has, not only from a legal perspective, but also an economic perspective.
Understand. So could you please tell us what are the main obstacles right now in Portugal public procurement processes that actually they're facing? Well,
Portugal is a good example to talk about here because we have fairly detailed and in some cases perceived to be overly detailed rules on how to run public procurement. The country itself has probably too many contracting authorities. We're talking about more than 3,000 contracting authorities. So there's an atomization of the procurement landscape. This means effectively that we have an over-reliance in Portugal on direct award as a mechanism, not a procedure to award contracts. And beyond the direct award, there is a monoculture of the open procedure. So those are the two main ways that you see procurement being done in the country. So we end up having, I think, a low penetration for framework agreements and dynamic purchasing systems. The situation with the direct award is so interesting to mention here because when it comes down to goods and services, almost as much money in a given year is being spent via direct awards as it is via the open procedures. The reason for that being that most of the procurement ends up being done below the thresholds. So there's a lot of procurement below thresholds. And there's a reason why contracting authorities like to use the direct award versus more transparent mechanisms is because it reduces the risk of legal challenges. And that I think is the fundamental problem and issue in Portugal is if you want to bring a legal challenge against a decision by the contracting authority, it's very easy, it's very cheap, and it will take 4 years, 2, 3, 4 years to sort in the courts because all the disputes go straight to the administrative courts in Portugal, and those have been collapsed since that rule was introduced, over 20 years ago.
So you don't have in Portugal something like we have here in Slovakia, like this public procurement office that has like this two levels where you can actually also decide about some objections and things like this? Nothing like that exists in Portugal?
No. That structure is a structure that is more modern, and you can see it more commonly in the EU member states that have adopted procurement rules more recently. So the structure that you have here in Slovakia, and for example Croatia also has, and even in the Balkans, the countries in the accession area of the Balkans, they tend to have a more modern approach to deal with disputes. Portugal, because it was responding to decades of problems, of difficulties with dealing with public administration, because for many years during the dictatorship and after that, the public administration could not be found you could not bring a case against the public administration. It was very, very difficult. So the legislator back in 2002 or something decided, well, that was completely wrong, so let's go swing the pendulum in the opposite direction. And the best way to solve disputes is in the courts. The problem is with so many procurement happening and in a culture that is prone to litigation, that meant that since 2002, 2004, the administrative court jurisdiction has been completely collapsed with procurement cases.
I understand. And do you also see some coloration that they have all these very strict rules also because of this European funding? Because what is happening in Slovakia is that because we have exactly as you that many contract authorities that are mandatory to use public procurement, we have so many controls because of the European funding, because we are still so beneficial at this moment, even though we are so many years in the European Union. And of course, these controls actually make the system really difficult, very bureaucratic, and is very process-oriented. So what you can see here is somewhere in the middle, everybody is forgetting why the procurement we are doing in the first place, to find the most economical, in the best possible way offer. And the process is now more important because it's much easier to check it. Mm-hmm. And this then becomes a huge problem as in Slovakia, not only for the mayors, but also for the other contracting authorities.
That is a similar story in Portugal. Portugal has, until now, and that's going to change apparently, has an audit court that is involved in checking, in many cases, prior to the award or when the award happens and actually between the award and the contract being signed, to actually allow or not the contract to go ahead. So, and the audit court has expanded its remit over the years, and people in Portugal, in terms of people that are working in procurement, have express their dismay about what this effectively means for public procurement. That is changing now because the government has approved changes to the law that governs this audit court. So they're going to reduce the intervention of the court. They've already done that for EU funds. Ironically, they've done that for EU funds. So they reduced the controls for EU funds a few years ago. And now they're going to actually try to get it out of being involved in the procurement workflow during the procurement processes before the award. So that is going to be a sea change for the country.
We should definitely be inspired by that because we do just the opposite. The European funding has much bigger control, even more strict rules than actually the state budget processes regarding public procurement. All right, but let's move to the European level because we will know what is happening. We actually see that the new directives or regulations are in preparation. It now comes to this European products, excluding third country economic operators from the competition. This responsibility should be given at the contracting authority, which is very often mayor of the 200 citizens village. So can you please tell us more where this is heading and what are your thoughts about this?
Well, where this is heading, I would love to to be able to answer that question in a little bit more detail. The honest answer is that we don't know. It depends on what the Commission wants to do with the forthcoming revision of the directives. It might be a regulation. I cannot say that I have any insider information about that. What I can say is that I am sympathetic with the view that the decision in Kolin and Qingdao, the decisions or judgments, have created significant disturbance on a day-to-day basis to contracting authorities. Because as you rightly said, Pedro, this responsibility of deciding who can participate in procurement, and if they participate in the procurement process, what are the actual rules that are going to apply to them, is being thrown into the hands of these, I think, 250,000, 350,000 contracting authorities across the EU. It makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense. So this will have to be, I hope, regulated at EU level. My fear, and this is just a fear, I have, as I said, no inside information on this. My fear there is that the Commission might think that it should not be handled in the revision of the directives, and is going to try to come up with a new regulation, as it did with the International Procurement Instrument or the Foreign Subsidies Regulation, and handle that on a separate autonomous piece of legislation. I don't think that's a great idea.
Why?
Because it's, again, atomizing the legal regime and the legal framework that is applicable to procurement. Whereas the legislator, in first instance the Commission, but then in the co-legislators, the Parliament and the Council, they should be forced to take the difficult decisions in a single piece of legislation, because you have to coordinate everything that goes inside. When you have separate and autonomous pieces of legislation, that coordination disappears. So you end up, as you have now, in some circumstances, there's so much sectorial legislation out there that you need to decide, well, I'm going to comply with this one today, or I'm going to comply with another one today, because they are, frankly, contradictory. So that's why I think it should be solved. The difficult decisions should be solved in a main piece of legislation that handles procurement.
And what do you think? Is it better, when we know how different are all these European Union countries, is it better to be adopted as a directive or as a regulation?
I've been a vocal advocate of a regulation approach for many years. I think that after 6 or 7 generations of directives, I think we've done as much as we can do with that legislative instrument. There's plenty of evidence and examples in other areas of your law where the Commission and then the co-legislators have agreed that having regulated something with the directive first, that was not good enough to actually solve the problems. The biggest example that we all know is the GDPR, right? It was regulated originally in the 90s with 1 or 2 directives, I think. And then in 2014, it was made a decision to actually transform it into regulation, because the approach to protecting those rights was so different from member state to member state that it required a more uniform approach to deal with that area of the law. I think that we've reached that point as well for procurement, especially if you still accept, as I do, that the main reason of why we have procurement rules is to open up the market. Those 6 generations of directives have failed in opening up the market. Most procurement, over 95% of spend, stays in the member state. It means that cross-border procurement is not working. So if you really want to have an internal market in procurement, the directives are not the tool for that. And my view is that even for other objectives, which I may have reservations about, the directives are not a good way to go about and achieve those objectives.
Okay, please, let's discuss this a little bit, because actually until this effort of Commission to kind of close the European market, there was this general knowledge that the European market is considered the most open market in the world, I would say, without really any limitations. I remember when actually there became this possibility to exclude these third countries from the tenders. Even for me, it was a total shock, because for many years you live by these principles that actually it is open market, the equality of the chances, and so on and so on. So suddenly the approach is completely different, and you actually just mentioned the opposite, that you don't think that it was still not open enough.
Well, I'm saying that it's not open enough internally inside of the EU. So the dichotomy you're mentioning is correct, and it's right, because one of the issues, for example, we have is that we have this idea of the thresholds, and the internal market for EU law, for the internal market for procurement is determined by the thresholds, which are themselves external commitments that the EU has made, for example, in the government procurement agreement or with free trade agreements that it has done with its partners. And also that makes no sense. All procurement should be inside of the internal market, which doesn't mean that, low-value procurement should be subject to the same detailed rules. That's a different story. But they should all be part of the internal market. The question then is what we do with those economic operators that come from outside of the EU. Now, historically, the EU has taken an approach that our doors are open to everyone. So anyone can come. And we think that that will convince other countries to do the same for us. And that hasn't happened. The problem is, it has created a status quo. And I remember when the Commission first considered proposing a regulation that ended up being the international procurement instrument. That was maybe in 2012, 2013. I was commissioned by the European Parliament to write an opinion, a piece of work on the potential implications. And it was evident for me, even as a lawyer, it was evident for me that if we play with the status quo, that is going to entail retaliation, because we're closing what was open so far. It means, but they have closed as well. But they can retaliate beyond what is already closed. And that's the bit that you don't understand, is that retaliation can be very asymmetric. And we had a perfect example of that when the IPI was used for the first time against China a couple of years ago, targeting Chinese companies that wanted to participate in the medical devices procurement here in the EU above 5 million euros. They've been excluded. China retaliated apparently symmetrically in the way that they've banned the participation of EU companies in the Chinese market, but the actual implication is that it's for the whole of the Chinese market. So below 5 million and including private and public procurement as well. So the actual retaliation of the Chinese was much stronger than our use of the IPI. So that didn't surprise me. It has surprised people at your level. And all I can say is that I told you so.
What did you expect?
What did you expect? You're playing with the status quo. So obviously they will retaliate because you're taking something that is on the table for them at the moment. So the EU is in a very difficult position in that regard. And I don't really have an obvious way out for this. I think that mechanisms that are designed procedure by procedure, to be applied procedure by procedure, are more effective than grandstanding mechanisms like the IPI. Because IPI is clearly the EU saying to the Chinese and to China as a country, we don't want you in this market. Whereas when you apply the foreign subsidies regulation, you're saying, no, Chinese companies can come, but this Chinese company cannot come because they are falling foul of our rules. So you're targeting a company and you're excluding a company here instead of targeting the country. So it's easier to navigate and not to trigger retaliation. So for example, I think it was this week, I just saw in the news that there was a case in Portugal of a foreign subsidies regulation where for the expansion of metro in Lisbon, the winning consortium had included a Chinese subcontractor, which fell foul of the foreign subsidies regulation, and the consortium took him out and replaced him with a Polish subcontractor. So you can see that actually having an effect, which is not expected to trigger, a violent reaction from China on this regard.
And so what do you think economically will happen if really we adopt all these proposals of the regulation? So from the economical point of view, aren't we become even more expensive? Because the whole point of the public procurement is, of course, to save taxpayers' money. This is one of the main reasons why we actually regulate all these processes. But now the regulations are coming at such a high level that are we actually thinking about if we are going to save some money, or if it's not going to hurt us by over-regulating ourselves?
I think it's worse than that. Is you're taking competitive pressure out of the market, and in some circumstances, that is very, very problematic because you already have low competitiveness to start with. That is the first thing. The second one is in some countries, especially those countries in the eastern side of the EU, in the southeastern side of the EU, where they tend to have more economic operators coming, for example, from Turkey or coming from that area of the world participating in that procurement, you're effectively saying to them, well, they shouldn't be here. Okay, so they shouldn't be here, so what does that mean? Is that the local market is not enough, the local supply of economic operators, is not enough to serve those needs, so the price is going to go up. Because you don't see the European companies, or let's say the German companies or the French companies, interested in those markets now. And they're not going to be interested in the future. Because if they were interested, they would be there already, right? So I think it's very problematic, and it's going to affect asymmetrically the member states. So the member states are going to be affected more than others. One of the things I've noticed, looking at Portuguese media over the last few months, was an interest twice, I think, from the Turkish Association of Construction Companies visiting Portugal because they want to participate more in public procurement in Portugal, because I guess, and that's my reading, that they realize that South and Eastern Europe, because it's more exposed to call-in and the effects of call-in, the call-in judgment, it's more likely to ban them than Portugal is. So they're looking for new markets to deploy their capacity. And beyond Turkey as well, I also saw some news of, I think it was a similar association or some sort of a high-level visit from Saudi Arabian companies, construction companies in Portugal as well, which is a reversal of what tended to happen. So I think that outright banning is very problematic. I think it's going to leave the market less competitive, less able to supply the needs of contracting authorities in at least a few member states. It's not going to affect Germany or Denmark or France, but it's going to affect the smaller member states that are more exposed to these players.
Like Croatia, for example.
Like Croatia, yes.
They're one of the greatest examples of this. But also, what about these European products? Because these regulations go even at this level, not only about excluding some third countries' economic operators, but now they even want to define what is European product. So this will be another request or requirement.
That is another addition to the complexity of procurement processes overall. I mean, for the proponents of those ideas, they think, well, I've got this policy idea. It would be great if I could exercise and get it applied some way. And the easiest win for them usually is procurement, because that doesn't trigger a pushback, and the procurement community is not really able to stand up and say, no, this is terrible for us, right? So what this means is that you have these pebbles that each of these ideas and the proponents of these ideas have one pebble. Say, oh, this is just a small pebble. I'm going to put this pebble in the hands of the contracting authority. It's just a small pebble. And those pebbles have been growing for the last 10 or 15 years. So when you have a new piece of legislation, that piece of legislation will interact with the existing ones. So you think, well, it's only another one piece of legislation or another requirement. Yes, but because of its interacting effects with the rest of the legislative framework that is already in place, the complexity grows exponentially. And what we're seeing and observing here as well is something that I'm particularly concerned about and worried about, which is this move of procurement and procurement rules being used to regulate how we do procurement, to instead regulating what we buy.
Exactly.
And I think we need to do one or the other, right? And you can say, well, how we run procurement was the old way of doing things. Okay, fine. Then if you think that, then you should only focus on what to buy, but you should get rid of how to buy. This means that probably the logical consequence is that we don't necessarily need a specific piece of legislation like the directives for procurement if we're worried about what to buy instead of how we buy, because those directives are mostly focused on how we buy. It's when you try to mix the what and how we buy that becomes really, really complex for contracting authorities to comply with those requirements.
But in the future, we already have the examples where we're actually limited about what to buy. I don't know, some minimum watts in, what's the name of...
the lamps.
The bulbs.
Lights,
and things like this. So this is not entirely new approach for us. And we did it back then. And now it is adopted and nobody even now is in a maze or something like this. Yeah. We just take it as a normal everyday life that we have some limitations, minimum, maximum about these things. So
it's more complex than that, because now for those bulbs, if you look at the idea of Buy European, then you have to think, oh, where are these bulbs coming from? What's the supply chain of these bulbs? So you're not just regulating what you're actually buying, is the whole supply chain and processes that led to the item that you're buying. And that is fiendishly complex. It's just the people proposing these ideas have no understanding of the costs in complexity and the costs in transaction and opportunity costs that is going to generate for contracting authorities, first and foremost, but also for economic operators.
So are we, in fact, buying cheaper with all these public procurement rules?
Are we buying cheaper? You'd have to study exactly what's happening, and I don't think that has been done. My gut feeling is the more you try to load into procurement, and just procurement and not the wider economy, the more expensive procurement becomes. And there's no such thing as a free lunch. So if you're requiring more and you're restricting the economic operators that can show up or what they can present to you, you effectively, in general, you're going to increase the cost. That's what you'd expect to happen. And my reply to those ideas is usually the same, which is, if it's such a great idea, why are you deploying it only just in procurement? So why don't you deploy it across the whole of the spectrum to private and public businesses, to private businesses as well? Because it's such a great idea, right? And if you tell me then, if you cannot tell me why then just should be done by procurement, then it tells me that you're just looking for an easy way to obtain your goal without considering the implications.
But there is an opinion that because this is taxpayers' money, many more criteria has to be involved in picking up the right supplier. But then again, I still am asking, are we really then buying cheaper? Because yes, it might be a little bit more sustainable, but the requirements are now becoming at such a high level that aren't we actually making it a little bit too expensive? I mean, when it will be enough? Because those demands and the requirements are obviously only increasing. Mm-hmm. They are not decreasing at all.
It's never going to be enough. So, again, procurement is probably not the right way to go about and deliver those objectives, whatever they are. So I'm all for the contracting authorities to have the flexibility to decide if they want to do it or not. And if they want to do it, as you see it, for example, a lot in Danish contracting authorities, fine, it's their decision and their judgment. Say, well, I want to spend my money in this particular way that is more green or more sustainable, whatever it is. The problem is trying to force that on everyone and without realizing that the budgets are what they are and they're not going to go up. So if you can expect the costs to go up in general, and I think that is accepted that in general the costs would go up, then that means that you're going to be doing less. So you're going to have less to show for your money. And you say, well, it's more sustainable, it's more green. Sure, but you've got less. So that is a political trade-off that by hiding the costs in procurement, you're not forcing that discussion to happen. So if this was a discussion that would be held at a political level, and there was a political decision to do it that way, then sure. But what I'm seeing is that procurement is being used as a tool to deliver its objectives without really engaging in the political discussion of the implications that it has for the budgets. Because even when you say, well, but the governments are part of the council and you've got European Parliament too, sure, but they're not applying the rule, designing the rules just for themselves, right? They design the rules for all the contracting authorities all across the EU. So there is significant implications beyond a government in a country when you look at the overall makeup of public bodies that apply procurement rules.
I'm also curious about your point of view about right now the statistics shows that actually the small enterprises are not so successful in the public procurements because there are simply too many rules that they cannot deliver. Now with this proposal to exclude these three countries, economical operators, do you think this might help the small local businesses?
Not really, because the small businesses, they would, if you look at the definition of SMEs, especially the micro level, more than SMEs or more than the medium ones.
So like up to 50 employees. Yeah.
50 employees, 250 million, or whatever. So it's not even the M's that are the problem, the medium ones. It's the S's and the small ones and the micro ones. Those should be participating, I would imagine, for the most part, in procurement below the thresholds. So it has nothing to do with EU law, as in substantive EU procurement law. It has to do with then all those sectorial pieces of legislation that constrain how contract authorities can operate, but not because the rules are complex or whatever. If the rules in a member state are complex below the thresholds, is because the member state has regulated in that way. So they could have done it differently. So Portugal, for example, they are, in my view, ill-advisedly, they are reviewing now the public contracts code as we are revising the directives as well. So the government has approved a new piece of legislation. And apparently they want to increase the thresholds for direct awards significantly and also increase significantly the thresholds for what they call the preliminary consultation or prior consultation process, which is just you go out to the market as a contracting authority and you choose which 3 companies you want to get bids from. So that's the way to do it, not the way that I would do it, right? Because I think that is fairly problematic for other reasons. But that is a recognition that you need to make procurement at the lower levels easier for SMEs and especially the micro companies to participate. And I remember when I was working in UK, this was maybe 14, 15 years ago, that with the help of 3 small local authorities in Wales, and I mean small, we designed, before the directives, the current revision of the directives, we designed a fairly simplified open procedure to be used below the thresholds because they had flexibility to do whatever they wanted. And it was very successful. It was really well considered by local suppliers, especially the smaller ones, because we really facilitated as much as possible their life in terms of participating in procurement. So my answer is, it can be done and it should be done. And if it's not being done, below the thresholds at least, then the finger should be pointed at the governments of each member state for not doing it.
Very interesting. And do you know there is also the opinion of other experts in the public procurement that actually this exclusion of the third country economic operators should be even mandatory, and that they should kind of explain or pardon if they actually decide they want them to involve. So completely opposite approach. I know this is law. I know this is not a science. I know this is about the political decisions, about conversations and agreements. But what do you think about this proposal?
Well, don't say to my colleagues from law that law is not a science, as they may have a different view about that.
I even insist on stating this. Like all these political acts that we have, for example, in our country, I just insist it's not a science.
It's not a science, okay. So, to answer both of your questions, Dark, I mean, I don't think there's a real overlap between those third country operators and the markets that micro and small companies would be operating on. I think they are a little bit like the different currents in altitude, the wind currents in altitude. They can work very differently depending on the altitude that you're in. I think the same thing happens here, is that those companies, the third country operators, will operate at a higher end of the market because of the transaction costs and opportunity costs to go to a different country. So I don't think the SMEs are going to be particularly affected by their participation or not. Regarding your second question, which I lost myself here now.
The mandatory use.
The mandatory use. So some people think, well, we should reverse and say, well, it's prohibited their participation of third country operators unless the contracting authority justifies why they're coming in. My view is that pushing this to the contracting authorities is, again, a recognition that someone somewhere is not willing to pay the political costs of taking that decision. So that should be the commission that should determine those rights of participation. So because the Court of Justice has considered that participation of procurement is part of an exclusive competence of the Union, it's for the Commission to decide that. So the Commission not deciding that and say, well, it's for the contracting authorities, it's 300,000 or whatever, that must decide on a case-by-case basis. It's a cop-out. It's atomizing the decisions and the complexities of that decision, because those decisions, whatever they are, in favor or against their participation, are going to be challenged. So they're going to go to the courts. So it's increasing the surface area of attacks against the decisions that are being taken by the contracting authorities, which they shouldn't be taking, because it shouldn't be for them to decide if an economic operator should participate or not, unless it's for something directly connected with the contract. And that's not the case here. Is that because they are inside or outside the tent from a perspective of being part of a free trade agreement or the GPA. So I disagree with any view that the decisions should be taken by the contracting authorities. That should be solved. The Commission should eat its own dog food, as it said, as the Americans say it, and they should be making that decision via a piece of legislation and not pass it down to contracting authorities. So I don't even think that It should be the member states, because once the court has considered procurement to be part of an exclusive competence of the union, whether I like it or not, then the member states cannot legislate that area. So it has to be the Commission.
Thank you very much. Would you like to share some last comments with us and with our listeners?
Well, there was some extra comments I had about Portugal that might be interesting that I forgot to mention when we're talking about Portugal.
Please.
If my iPad would work. One of the things that Portugal has for procurement is that it has a very low importance in the overall economy. So whereas the average in the EU is around 15% of the GDP that gets spent via procurement, in Portugal it's just 5 to 6%. It's really, really low.
With so many contracting authorities? Why is that?
Because there's no money. We had the financial crisis and we did not recover it. So that has shrunk the market. That has shrunk the ability of the country to invest. Even today, with the money from the Recovery and Resilience Facility, we're up to maybe 6% of GDP and not more than that. So that is then supported or enhanced in a bad way by low capacity, both in the economic operator side and also in the contracting authority side, limited resources, and then a view that the country has, and it's not the only country that sees it this way, that the most obvious route to solve the problem is changing a law. And that is not the case.
The science.
No, that's not the case. It's cheap and easy to change a law. It's hard and expensive to change a culture and change the processes. Changing the incentives, changing how people operate, that costs a lot of money. So you can see successive governments in Portugal saying, we have these issues in procurement, let's change the code, the public contracts code.
But it also takes very, very long time, in many cases, to actually change really the thinking of the people. I can see it when I have all these discussions and about these different member states, not even member states. It really takes a long time to actually change thinking of the people.
Yeah, on that I would say that one of the most interesting papers I've read over the last 10 years was done by a couple of people that were working at the time, I don't know if it's still there, for the European Bank for the BRD, European Bank for, not the European Bank, the American one, the international, the one that covers South America, I don't remember, the bank, the one that covers South America, the international organizations, the international banks. And what they found out was, whereas most countries invested a lot in changing the law and thinking, well, we changed the law, so we've done what we need to do in procurement to make it good, the real positive outcomes came from those countries that kept on investing in the intangibles, which is changing the culture, changing the processes, training people, giving them resources. And the actual change and the actual bulk of the changes came from that second level of investment instead of just changing the law. So it takes time, but it can be done.
And something else you would like to share, considering the Portugal rules or specifications even?
There's some interesting stuff from Portugal as well. Most, I think, a fairly significant percentage of spend is done below the thresholds, which explains the 5 and 6% GDP weight as well. The other thing that I noticed, because Portugal produces a report every year for the procurement practice. It's only available in Portuguese, unfortunately. But one of the things I noticed there, because is there is an attempt to map out the use of the most economically advantageous tender, so multi-factor criteria for awarding contracts. And 97% of them are still lowest price and lowest price only in Portugal.
The same here. Same here.
And only 1.83% add any green criteria.
But I have to add that for Slovakia, the main reason, as is discussed, is because of the controls that I mentioned at the beginning of our podcast. The fear is simply the greatest factor and prevails over fighting the quality. So this is what is happening here.
I think it's fairly similar in Portugal. My pushback against that is I don't particularly see a problem with lowest price. In fact, trying to use the most economically advantageous tender and rolling it out, which has not happened, in general across Europe, despite attempts to do it, is effectively a recognition that the contracting authority is enabled at the beginning to decide what is good and calculate what is good and what it really wants. Because if it has done that and done that well, then the lowest price should be the only variable. putting it in a way that puts out to the market to decide and effectively shape the view of the contracting authority via those additional criteria, for me, it's suboptimal versus what should be done, which is the contracting authority spending more time and effort to know exactly what it wants and the multiple variables that it wants to cover in its procurement process, and then distilling that in the tender documents and the technical specifications, so that the only variable at the end is the price.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Thank you that you find the time to come to our podcast. It was a very interesting conversation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
You were listening to the podcast of Public Procurement Office with Petra Šupáková.
Podcast of the PPO. Podcast about everything from the world of public procurement.